Welcome to the fantasy zone. Get ready.
Let's take a trip back to the early 2000s.
1, 2, 3.
You'd walk into a video store, walk up to the shelves lined with games, and grab one just based on whichever had the coolest looking cover and vague blurb on the back. Nowadays, there's a wealth of online articles and videos, like the one you're watching right now, to steer you in the right direction of what games are good and bad, but there was something exciting about taking a game home, having no idea what you were gonna get. Yeah, it was a bit of a gamble as to what the quality of the game would be, but honestly, in the 6th console generation, there was an abundance of at least decent and oftentimes interesting games to be found. While all the consoles were great, the PS2 in particular had some really unique passion projects put forward by developers. Often these games were sold at a bargain price and were incredibly bizarre, but they always managed to leave a lasting impression for their originality. Because the game industry was booming, even still in Japan, developers and publishers could afford to take a risk on ideas that weren't always accessible or easily understood by the mainstream, but were just the games that they wanted to make, especially with the PS2 being the best-selling games console of all time. Nowadays, games tend to play it a bit safer if they have a budget behind them, with indie devs mostly being the ones who are innovating. But that magical time of experimental 6th generation titles had the perfect balance between AAA polish and indie originality. And it's for that reason that I really like this very specific point in video game history. And today's game falls right into that period, warts and all. It's certainly flawed, but the core experience is really unforgettable. Developed by Sandlot and published by Enix America, it's Robot Alchemic Drive, or RAD for short, for the PS2. A giant robot action game that's meant to be an homage to classic mecha anime of the past. Sandlot's name might sound familiar, as they're also responsible for the Earth Defense Force series. EDF originally started as budget titles for the PS2 under D3's Simple series, but its unprecedented success led to being an internationally recognized franchise, still going strong to this day, and now Sandlot's main bread and butter. So how come RAD and its spiritual sister games, which we'll talk about later, never got the same recognition? While the two games have quite a bit in common, most noticeable is how laughable the story and performances are in both. EDF mostly had its plot in the background as radio chatter while you blasted through the campaign, but RAD's story is more upfront and attempts to weave a compelling narrative. Attempts. To make a long story short, humans and other organic life forms are unable to travel into space, even in ships or suits, due to a kind of radiance called nectar. Humanity abandons its aspirations for space travel and assumes intelligent life will never come to Earth, but huge metal monsters known as the Volgara crash and run amok, being immune to the radiance. Thankfully, your dad, now deceased, saw this coming and blew all of his money investing into giant robots called Mega Knights if such a thing ever happened. So you, as one of 3 playable teenagers, take control of your giant robot, protecting your hometown of Senjo and doing your best to protect the interests of the everyday people, especially your friends. It's not a bad story by any means, but I feel like if RAD played it perfectly straight, the narrative mostly would have been forgotten and a bit of a pain, since while the cutscenes can be fast-forwarded, they can't be skipped. But whether by freak accident or sheer cunning on the part of Enix America, RAD has the dubious honor of having one of the funniest, awful performances of any game I've played in recent memory. I have heard a fair bit online about how the dub was intentionally bad, but I was never able to find any direct quotes from someone who worked on the game's localization to confirm this. I kinda prefer to keep the mystery to myself, but either way, it works unbelievably well. Now, rather than just being average, the cutscenes and story are actually enjoyable, albeit in an ironic way, but it also reinforces RAD's intended aesthetic as a pastiche of old-school anime. And this quality of script and voice acting is exactly what you would hear back in the day, at least in English-speaking territories. I mean, have you watched an old dubbed anime recently?
What the fuck?
In Japan, it made sense for the voice actors to play it straight since they never had this problem, but since the West's experience with vintage Japanese animation is chock full of lousy localizations, RAD manages to, intentionally or not, recontextualize its homage to make sense to English-speaking territories. It's actually kind of brilliant.
Welcome to the Evacuation Guidance Group. I'm Captain Hayakawa.
You're crude and lewd. I think that it's a good thing.
This isn't a movie. This is real. This is reality.
I'm just doing my voice training. There's nothing interesting to see here.
Robots kill people. A robot killed Grandma.
But in terms of gameplay, RAD is kind of a different animal. The fact that it's so much less accessible than EDF becomes immediately apparent once you start the tutorial. Unlike EDF's pick-up-and-play third-person shooting that can be understood almost immediately, RAD blurs the line between action and simulator mech titles by using an intentionally stiff and awkward control scheme. Movement isn't mapped to the analog sticks like you would expect. Instead, each individual footstep is performed one at a time by hitting the shoulder buttons in alternation. To turn, you hold both shoulder buttons on one side, and to attack, each individual fist is controlled by each analog stick. Projectiles are mapped to the face buttons, and you can perform certain special moves by inputting fighting game-esque button combinations. It sounds ridiculous and convoluted, and it kind of is, but you know what, it actually kind of works, because besides really making you feel the weight of these huge pieces of machinery, the game is still built around these controls, for the most part. Your enemies, the Volgara, are equally matched in terms of mobility, and the tank-like controls never constrain you since you're always fighting in huge open areas. You're also plenty equipped, especially as you buy the various upgrades the game offers, meaning there's plenty of ways to go into each fight, and each player will find a strategy and playstyle that's comfortable for them. The campaign for the game is well paced, giving you a really generous grace period to come to terms with the controls before they start mixing things up and putting variations on the usual mission structure around the halfway point. Soon, you'll unlock other Mega Knights, allowing you to switch it up for variety, sometimes by force. One level, your Mega Knight breaks, requiring you to run around on foot, lobbing grenades at the enemies. Another level, another Mega Knight will come in to assist you. Eventually, they start to throw in more than one Volgara at once, and so on and so forth. Plus, as anecdotal as this is gonna sound, it's just straight up fun. Every punch, every hit feels wildly satisfying. You have so many moves and gadgets at your disposal that it never feels like you're relying on the same moves over and over again. Enemies go flying back, crumbling entire buildings in their path. You can even launch them thousands of feet in the air. And whenever you take one of these things out, they always go up in a huge, rewarding explosion. It'll take some time getting used to, but I really recommend playing the game with the default control scheme rather than the streamlined alternative that you can pick. It just simply wouldn't be as special without the standard style Sandlot made, and I can't imagine playing RAD any other way. If RAD had a more typical, expected control setup, the combat wouldn't be nearly as interesting. It'd be fine, sure, but this maximalist way of handling your Mega Knight makes the game a bit more challenging, demands more of your attention, and adds a bit of a learning curve, which isn't for everyone, but is certainly enjoyable in my opinion. Another big twist comes with how you're actually multitasking. In mech games, it's standard for the player character to be riding inside the mech, safe inside their cockpit as you romp around, but that's not the case for RAD. In the context of the game's story, you're actually controlling these robots from a distance with the familiar looking remote control. Because of this, you can't just charge into battle, missiles and flamethrowers blazing. You first need to get yourself into a safe position. Then, when you switch over to your Mega Knight, the game switches to kind of a first-person view, automatically looking in its general direction, which is kinda genius. Again, it's going to take some getting used to, not always having a reliable camera angle and having to find it yourself, but its effects are actually twofold. On the one hand, it gives some strategic depth, keeping the game from just being a standard slugfest as you need to get an optimal vantage point. It's actually possible, and even encouraged by the game's tutorials, to ride on the shoulder of your Mega Knight, giving you the best possible angle, but at the risk of getting yourself seriously injured in the process. The second effect is giving RAD a really great sense of scale. You look at most other games that feature giant robots, monsters, and what have you, and you never get to appreciate how this is happening on a colossal size, since it never puts it all into perspective. The camera's always pulled way back, and what reason would they have to zoom in when you're playing as those giant monsters or robots? But in RAD, you're not looking at these things as an omniscient observer. Having to look up at these things from a low-angle view on the sidewalks, or from atop a nearby building, or even on the shoulder of these metal titans really just reminds you how huge of a conflict this all is. The game will occasionally show the action zoomed out via TV reports or cutscenes, but for the most part, you're a normal-sized human being dwarfed by these tremendous battles. Along with the weight you feel from the controls and the sluggishness of the characters, RAD is a rare breed of game that actually conveys its size well. It does feel like you're playing as a gigantic metal monstrosity, stories tall, not just a standard video game character that just happens to be big. It also helps that RAD has a pretty nice draw distance. This is actually pretty common for a lot of Sandlot games, but it's especially impressive for the PS2 era. Sure, it's not the prettiest game around, even when keeping the game's low budget in mind, but Sandlot clearly invested their resources into making everything visible and with as little fog as possible. And you know what? Thank God. The city of Senjo might look a little sparse in detail at times, but they had their priorities straight on what mattered. And while your surroundings might look plain, the other priority was on making the Mega Knights and Volgara look as sharp as possible. It's standard for video games to make the main playable unit look better than anything else, since that's mostly what you're going to be looking at for the next 14 hours, but the gap in quality is comically huge for RAD. And all that detail went to good use, since all of the units, both friend and foe, boast some really nice designs courtesy of art director Toshihiro Kawamoto, who's probably best known for his work as character designer on Cowboy Bebop, which kind of explains why this scientist guy has Spike Spiegel's hair. Besides just looking cool, both the Mega Knights and Volgara's designs make sense for the type of game RAD is trying to be. These aren't sleek, state-of-the-art machines, they're big, clunky battle bots. All the mechanical units being so pokey makes a lot of sense when they look the part. They also have a pretty classical design to them, fitting RAD's aesthetic of being one big love letter to old-school mech anime. Considering how few games Kawamoto has been involved in compared to his anime filmography, it's pretty impressive how he understood the way a character's design factors into the design of the game. And then there's the soundtrack. Booting up the game for the first time, I was really excited to see game composing veteran Masafumi Takada in the game's opening credits. He's done some brilliant work on the majority of Grasshopper Manufacturers games, the entire Danganronpa series, and a selection of tracks for the more recent Smash Bros. Titles. But while Takada certainly nails the authenticity on this particular score, I'm sorry to say that it's one of his less memorable works. Every track in the game sounds just like what the developers had in mind for this huge tribute to classic anime and kaiju monster movies. Big, booming orchestras with slow, plodding themes that pace well with the game's sluggish action. But I'll be damned if I could remember a single tune after I actually turned the game off. Takada is always pretty good at matching the aesthetic of whatever project he's signed onto, but I find that it's the more experimental and out there games like Killer 7 and Dangan where he really gets to shine. But for this one, he feels a bit more restrained. Again, it's just the kind of sound this game needed, so I'll give it a thumbs up for being appropriate, but in my opinion, it's still one of his weaker offerings. And unfortunately, the criticisms don't stop there. As much as I could go on and on about how great RAD's core combat and gameplay are, it does drop the ball by having some ideas that cloud its core vision. The biggest mistake RAD makes that comes dangerously close to undermining the whole experience is the emphasis on protecting certain buildings. Early on, the game establishes a penalization system for destroying certain structures. Initially, your only real punishment is getting a slightly lower payout at the end of each level to use in the in-game shop, protecting certain buildings, making sure as few buildings are destroyed as possible, and so on. The amount you make in each level is high enough that this isn't really a big deal and it can easily be ignored, but it's still pretty unsatisfying and really just seems counterintuitive to what the game is going for. No, the real letdown comes when you have to watch out for certain buildings that are important to your friends, which will impact your relationships with them and change what kind of ending you get. And then later they throw in some missions where you have to protect certain buildings to avoid getting a game over, and it just does not work in a game like this. The stiff controls take getting used to, sure, but they do work. But this one little slip just makes you feel like a bull in a china shop being punished for playing the game normally, going in no holds barred. It's even worse since the game's map is entirely unhelpful, not marking specific areas of interest that need to be protected. I can understand they maybe wanted to do that whole Deadly Premonition thing of having you figure out the lay of the land on your own, allowing you to grow more attached to Senjo since nearly every mission takes place there. But it just leads to frustration when you inevitably flatten a building you didn't recognize and get punished for it. On the other hand, it does make the world feel more alive. It responds to you, acknowledges you, the story's dynamic and interactive, and your actions have direct impact on how the story plays out. And isn't that just what a video game story should be? But it needed to be one or the other. Mechs you have more control over and can be more careful with, or no punishment for destroying buildings, and given how satisfying the core combat is, I think it's fair to say the latter should have been scrapped. It's definitely a lesson Sandlot themselves seem to have learned, since their current cash cow, the Earth Defense Force series, has basically no punishment for destroying anything and lets you go hog wild. In fact, it's kind of interesting to compare RAD to EDF. RAD feels as though it's trying to make something serious. Without the ridiculous localization, it's a story about humanity's twilight years and helplessness against a titanic force assaulting the Earth, with real consequences for your in-game actions. EDF, on the other hand, goes all in for popcorn thrills, acknowledging its ridiculousness, downplaying the story significantly, and just running with traditional video gamey fun. Either way, it's pretty clear that nowadays Sandlot's priorities are pretty squarely set on Earth Defense Force. It's a series that's caved a dedicated niche for itself both in Japan and in the West. Like I mentioned earlier, EDF being a third-person shooter is a lot more accessible and easily understood by the general public, especially with how much more standard its control scheme is. And while I love the hell out of EDF, it really is a damn shame that Sandlot left this brilliant groundwork that could easily be improved in the dust. In fact, RAD actually precedes the EDF series with a spiritual predecessor on PS1 titled Remote Controlled Dandy. I've yet to play Dandy myself, but I have it on good record that those who've played both prefer RAD. It's just a concept that improves bit by bit as technology and budget improves with it. Sandlot would later make a sequel to Dandy on the PS2 and a licensed game in the same style, Tetsujin 28 Go, based on the genre-initiating mech anime of the same name, better known in the US as Gigantor. It's clear that Sandlot had a fondness for this concept with how many times they've revisited it, but much like how EDF improved tenfold when it was given a bigger budget and more advanced hardware and multiple installments from the devs to learn from their mistakes and iron out the kinks, RAD is long overdue for a follow-up, direct or spiritual, that does the exact same. It'd be a damn shame to let this framework go to waste. The good news is RAD itself is still enjoyable and so much more than just a proof of concept, making it easily replayable today. But with some of the flaws that it has, you need to go in with the right mentality. Pretend it's the year 2002. You got that new Flaming Lips album in your CD player, Toonami's on Saturday nights, and you just got home from Blockbuster with some weird title you've never heard of that you picked off the shelf just because it looked cool, and being a kid with no dispensable income, you just have to roll with whatever the game throws at you and accept it. Even with all its faults, Robot Alchemic Drive still comes highly recommended.
Holy crap!